It's alive!
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Lost Tangent Outpost. My name is Spada, and welcome to the MultiVersus Living Roster. God, it feels good to be doing the Living Roster again. I miss doing this show. Alright, let's get some house cleaning out of the way first. There's a few of you that saw the thumbnail and thought, oh snap, Scorpion's coming to MultiVersus, and have no clue what the hell a Living Roster is, so let me start by explaining it. The Living Roster is a series that I created back in 2016 where we try to predict the roster for a fighting game. We've covered several fighting games up to now, but the point is that it's mostly about making an educated guess. And to be educated, we cover all the new trailers and announcements and all the roster leaks, though I do try and stay away from story leaks where I can. So if you're looking to stay up on and informed about MultiVersus, this is a solid channel to hang out at. I have an awesome community and I welcome you to it. Make sure to subscribe and like and share, all that stuff. The larger the community we have behind this endeavor, the more fun it gets. Okay, cool. That's done. Now on to the actual video. So we got to talk about the last episode where the topic was roster size. I asked you all how many characters you expected to see show up in the launch roster of MultiVersus. I asked you all to give me your input in a poll that I put in 3 separate places. I was genuinely worried that this was a huge endeavor to ask of you all, and as such was worried about whether I would receive any input at all. I'm so glad to say that it looks like about a quarter of those of you that watched the video did vote, which is fantastic. Hopefully we can get even more votes this time around. But before we discuss this episode's poll and what it's going to be about, we got to talk about the results of the last one. I gave you all 5 options to choose from. Those were 20, 24, 32, 40, and 48 characters. I explained in the episode that it felt most reasonable to guess 24. I didn't provide much of a reason for this. It just seems like the most conservative guess we can make with all the information that we currently have at our disposal. In the past, whenever I've provided what I consider to be a safe and conservative guess, the community tends to overshoot it, so I fully expected the results would end up in the range of 32 to 48 characters. But it's a new day. For the first time that I can remember, most of you guys sided with my conservative estimate, and by most I mean literally a majority with over 50%. So I thank you all for being on my side of this. All right, with that, let's go ahead and solidify the roster at 24. To do that, I'm going to remove the random character option because it has no place in the living roster anyways, and I'm going to replace it with a new open slot. Now, for those of you who answered something different and may have a tad bit of salt about your answer not winning the poll, just keep in mind that once we've filled these 24 slots, we will broach this topic again, so it's not over. Not to mention, as more information comes out and gets announced, the correct educated guess might push us in a different direction. Okay, finally, about 3 minutes in, and we can talk about the real reason most of you guys probably clicked on this video. So since we got the number of characters to predict, now we need to do the actual predicting. I want to be sure that I preface this part of the living roster with a disclaimer. There's an inclination for people to push and advocate for characters that they want more so than characters that are likely. So I want to try and reiterate that the idea isn't to make a large conglomerate of wish lists here, we're trying to predict. So keep that in mind as we go through this part of the process. I spent the last week thinking about how we should start this prediction. I made a case last episode about using logos as a method of organizing the episode. That is, logos that families of franchises would fit in. This just makes it easier to narrow down what I consider to be realistic guesses. Since we already know that they've dipped into several of these logos, HBO, Cartoon Network, Hanna-Barbera, Looney Tunes, DC Comics, and WB Pictures, it's reasonable in my mind to think that that's how they're picking the launch roster. And before I tell you the logo that we're focusing on today, assuming it wasn't already clear by the thumbnail, I also did want to mention a tweet from the co-founder of Player First Studios where he mentions that it really is the fans and players of the game that will decide the roster more so than themselves and WB. And while this might make some of you feel like it justifies going with wish list over prediction as a mentality, I caution you against this because of one thing. To get to the launch, they've likely already had to decide on most of the roster that'll be available at launch. So what they're doing now is likely going with what they think would be the most requested, and then we'll be taking a lot of feedback as they release characters post-launch. All right, so the first logo we're discussing is going to be Warner Brothers games, mostly because I think this is pretty straightforward. There are some very obvious options here, and the list of games that we could consider being represented in this category is pretty low. There are only a few games in the library that aren't already represented in the roster, given that the Arkham series, Injustice, the Suicide Squad versus the Justice League, and Gotham Knights are all DC games. They're already covered by the 4 DC characters in the roster. Under WB Games, I think there are 5 games that would qualify to have representatives appear. Mortal Kombat, Scribblenauts, Dying Light, Back 4 Blood, and the Shadow of series, those being Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War. Some of you might point to some other games like the Lego games and Hitman, but there are some strong limitations on these 2 properties. As far as Lego goes, WB actually seems to produce effectively all of Lego media, including movies, TV shows, and games. So if we're going to consider that IP, it makes the most sense to me to do it on its own, separate from all the other logos. And then with Hitman, it just seems to be in a confusing position. As far as I can tell, WB only helped to produce Hitman 2 and none of the others. So my research might be a little bit limited. We'll have to see. If you guys have any evidence to support that Hitman should have been in this video, then just let me know in the comments. All right, so that's 5 gaming IPs that could have representation. However, one of them, Dying Light specifically, seems pretty strange to me. I don't have a ton of experience with this game, to be fair. I never completed it, but it always took place in a first-person perspective, and I can't recall any particular characters headlining the franchise, whether that be through box art or advertising. So I'm not sure that there's one worth delving into specifically. So that leaves 4. Now, the only one of these franchises that I have any real deep connection to is Mortal Kombat, so for me that's the favorite, but Scribblenauts has had many successful games and iterations. The Shadow of series is really financially and critically successful, and Back 4 Blood is super big right now. The likelihood is that all of these games would end up having some kind of representation at one point or another throughout the life of the game, but I want us to consider at this point which one do you think is most likely to get the representation out of the gate. To me, the most obvious option is Mortal Kombat. There's a wealth of characters, several successful games and films, and Scorpion and Sub-Zero have been the 2 most requested characters that I've seen talked about so far. So from a development standpoint, it makes the most sense to me that one or both of these characters would be a super safe bet to include. And with that, here comes your first poll. Which franchise from Warner Brothers Games library do you guys think is most likely to be included at launch? Mortal Kombat, Back 4 Blood, Scribblenauts, or the Shadow of series. All right, and with that, let me explain how to participate in the poll. There are 3 locations you can go to vote. The first place is the Lost Tangent Outpost community page. If you're not, you should subscribe, because this will give you an alert when I post a poll on the channel, which is especially useful for this. The second place is Twitter, where you can follow me at Spada_LTO, and pinned to the top of my profile will be a poll to the current week's episode. The last place is a custom poll on a website called Straw Poll. There will be a link to this poll in the description of this video and in the pinned comment at the top. All 3 versions of this poll will have a deadline of Friday. Once Friday arrives, I will stop aggregating scores and will be locked down to an answer. Now, there's another issue that's obvious to me, and that's that we haven't picked a character from the franchises to be represented, and this is the next element that I want to talk about today. I don't like the idea of doing different polls, given that it's already a hassle to have to leave the video to participate. So instead, I'm going to ask you to simply tell me who you want from the IP that you selected to appear in the living roster. Now, it's obvious that I'm already leaning towards Scorpion if Mortal Kombat wins, since, he's the one in the thumbnail, but I'm not committing to that. So if you pick Mortal Kombat, just tell me what character you think they would choose from that game. If you choose Back 4 Blood, which character from that game, etc. You don't have to leave some complicated explanation if you don't want to. I do enjoy being able to read those kinds of comments, but you can just simply say, I voted for Mortal Kombat and I think Sub-Zero should be the representative. And remember, there's nothing to say that we can't change this later on, or that each game would only get a single rep. Based on what the developer is communicating, it looks like the only limit to appearances per IP is just making sure that enough brands get represented. So while we're only picking one character for now, we'll likely expand on this later down the road. And with that, we're at the end of another episode. Make sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. We need those comments to help sort out who we're putting in the first slot. And I'd also just like to hear your thoughts on everything going on with the living roster thus far. Especially if you guys liked the intro. I thought that was pretty fun. Thank you everyone for your continued support. Make sure to like and share all that stuff, and I'll see y'all next week. Until then, later.